April 12, 1945. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the marble corridors of the Capitol building as Vice President Harry S. Truman made his way to House Speaker Sam Rayburn's office. It was supposed to be a routine end to another routine day. Truman was looking forward to his usual bourbon and branch water, a quiet moment of camaraderie after the grinding work of presiding over Senate sessions. He had been vice president for exactly 82 days, a role that had proven frustratingly insignificant. Franklin Roosevelt had barely acknowledged his existence, meeting with him only twice since inauguration. Truman knew virtually nothing about the war's most critical decisions, nothing about diplomatic negotiations with Stalin and Churchill, nothing about the scientific projects consuming billions of dollars in secret facilities across the country. As he settled into Rayburn's office, someone handed him a message. The White House was calling. The number was National 1414, and the voice on the other end was urgent. Truman needed to come immediately. No explanation, just a summons. Truman hung up the phone and turned to Rayburn with a grimace. "Jesus Christ and General Jackson," he muttered, using his favorite expletive. He assumed Roosevelt wanted to see him for some kind of scolding. The president had a reputation for dressing down subordinates, and Truman figured he'd done something wrong. He never got to taste that bourbon. 20 minutes later, Truman was escorted up the stairs of the White House to Eleanor Roosevelt's private study. The First Lady was waiting for him, her face grave. She walked over and put her arm around the vice president's shoulders. The words she spoke next would change the course of human history. "Harry, the president is dead." For a moment, Truman couldn't speak. The man who had led America through the Depression and most of World War II was gone. The leader who had seemed invincible, who had won 4 presidential elections, who had guided the nation through its darkest hours, had died suddenly of a cerebral hemorrhage at his retreat in Warm Springs, Georgia. Roosevelt was dead, and Harry Truman, the haberdasher from Missouri, the man who had been kept in the dark about virtually every major decision, was now President of the United States. Truman found his voice and asked Eleanor Roosevelt, "Is there anything I can do for you?" Her response would haunt him for the rest of his life. "Is there anything I can do for you? For you are the one in trouble now." She understood what he was only beginning to grasp. He wasn't just inheriting the presidency. He was inheriting a war that was killing 900 Americans every single day. He was inheriting decisions that would determine the fate of millions. He was inheriting responsibilities that no man could possibly be prepared for, especially not a man who had been deliberately excluded from every major wartime discussion. At 7:08 that evening, Chief Justice Harlan Stone administered the presidential oath of office in the cabinet room. Truman's wife Bess stood beside him, along with Speaker Rayburn and several cabinet members. The ceremony was brief and somber. There was no celebration, no fanfare, just the weight of a world at war settling on the shoulders of a man who felt completely unprepared for what was coming. Minutes after taking the oath, Truman convened his first cabinet meeting. It was a preliminary session, mostly introductions and assurances that the government would continue functioning. But, after the other officials filed out, Secretary of War Henry Stimson lingered behind. Stimson was a careful man, precise in his language and deliberate in his actions. He approached the new president with obvious hesitation. There was something Truman needed to know, he explained. Something massive and secret. The United States was developing a new explosive of almost unbelievable destructive power. Stimson's words were vague, almost cryptic. He didn't provide details, didn't explain the science, didn't mention the name Manhattan Project. He simply wanted Truman to know that this project existed and that it would require presidential attention. Very soon, Truman later wrote that Stimson's briefing left him puzzled. The significance didn't register. After everything else he'd learned that day, after the shock of Roosevelt's death and the overwhelming responsibility of the presidency, this mention of a new explosive seemed like just another piece of wartime technology. Stimson, however, perceived Truman's reaction as dismissive, almost a snub. The Secretary of War left the meeting frustrated, knowing that the most important military development in human history had failed to capture the new president's attention. That night, alone in the White House for the first time, Truman wrote in his diary about the surreal nature of his situation. He had not been included in Roosevelt's planning. He knew nothing about the major decisions that had been made, or the ones that needed to be made. "I was not familiar with any of these things," he wrote, "and it was something to think about, but I decided the best thing to do was to go home and get as much rest as possible and face the music." But rest was impossible. Truman's mind raced through the implications of his new position. American forces were still fighting desperately across the Pacific. The invasion of Okinawa had begun just weeks earlier, and the casualty reports were staggering. Over 13,000 Americans would die on that island before the fighting ended. The battle for Iwo Jima earlier that year had cost 6,200 American lives. Every intelligence report suggested that an invasion of the Japanese mainland would be far worse, potentially costing hundreds of thousands of American casualties. The next morning, April 13th, Truman experienced his first taste of presidential security. Where once he had walked freely through the Capitol building, chatting with colleagues and moving about unnoticed, he now traveled with an entourage of cars, police, and Secret Service agents. The contrast was jarring. When he arrived at the Capitol for lunch with friends, reporters surrounded him as he left. These were men he had known for years, journalists who had covered his Senate career, but now they addressed him as Mr. President, and hung on his every word. Truman's response to their questions revealed his genuine bewilderment at his situation. "Boys, if you ever pray for me now," he told them. "I don't know whether you fellows ever had a load of hay fall on you, but when they told me yesterday what had happened, I felt like the moon, the stars, and all the planets had fallen on me." It wasn't false modesty or political theatre. It was the honest reaction of a man who understood the magnitude of what he faced. The statistics were overwhelming. World War II had already cost America over 1 million casualties. The nation's resources were stretched to their limits. Every day the war continued. Hundreds more Americans died. The pressure to end the conflict was enormous, but so was the pressure to end it correctly, in a way that would secure lasting peace and prevent future conflicts. In meetings with his staff and cabinet members, Truman began to grasp the complexity of his inheritance. The war in Europe was nearly over. Hitler's regime was collapsing, and German surrender was expected within weeks. But the Pacific War was different. Japan showed no signs of surrender despite devastating bombing campaigns and naval blockades. Intelligence estimates suggested that Japanese forces were preparing for a final, desperate defense of their homeland. Military planners were already developing invasion scenarios. Operation Olympic would target the southern island of Kyushu in November 1945. Operation Coronet would follow with an assault on the main island of Honshu in March 1946. The combined operations would involve 5 million troops, mostly American. Casualty estimates varied, but even the most optimistic projections suggested that hundreds of thousands of Americans would die in these invasions. This was the context in which Harry Truman began his presidency. A man kept in the dark about major decisions suddenly responsible for the most consequential choices in human history. A leader who had to learn about secret projects, diplomatic negotiations, and military strategies while the clock ticked toward increasingly desperate battles. The mention of that mysterious explosive would soon take on significance beyond anything Truman could imagine on that first confused day in office. The weight of presidential decision-making became crushingly apparent during Truman's first weekend in office. Intelligence briefings arrived hourly, each one revealing new layers of complexity in the global situation. Soviet forces were advancing rapidly through Eastern Europe, raising questions about post-war territorial arrangements that Roosevelt had been negotiating privately with Stalin-allied commanders in the Pacific, were requesting massive reinforcements for operations that Truman had never heard discussed. Congressional leaders were demanding meetings about budget appropriations for military programs whose purposes remained mysterious to the new president. On April 15th, 3 days into his presidency, Truman received a particularly disturbing intelligence summary about Japanese defensive preparations. Intercepted communications suggested that Japan was mobilizing every available civilian for homeland defense. Children were being trained to use bamboo spears. Elderly men and women were practicing with primitive weapons. The Japanese government was distributing propaganda declaring that death was preferable to surrender, that every citizen had a sacred duty to kill at least one American invader before dying themselves. These reports painted a picture of fanatical resistance that made military planners increasingly pessimistic about invasion casualties. Some estimates now suggested that American deaths could exceed 600,000, with Japanese civilian casualties potentially reaching into the millions. The prospect of such slaughter weighed heavily on Truman as he struggled to understand options he had never been briefed on. During these early days, Truman also began learning about the deteriorating relationship with the Soviet Union. Roosevelt had maintained careful diplomatic balance with Stalin, but intelligence reports revealed growing tensions over Poland, Eastern Europe, and post-war reconstruction plans. Soviet forces were behaving more like occupiers than liberators in territories they controlled. American diplomats were reporting increasing hostility from their Soviet counterparts. The complexity of managing this relationship while simultaneously planning the final phase of the Pacific War created strategic dilemmas that Roosevelt had been handling personally. Truman found himself trying to decode years of diplomatic correspondence, attempting to understand agreements and understandings that had never been fully documented. Every decision seemed connected to every other decision in ways that weren't immediately obvious to someone who had been excluded from the process. On April 18th, James Burns, who had been one of Roosevelt's closest advisors, provided Truman with his first hint about the true nature of Stimson's mysterious explosive. Burns mentioned casually that the United States was developing a weapon great enough to destroy the whole world. The comment was offhand, almost casual, but it stopped Truman cold. What kind of weapon could destroy the world? How was such a thing possible? And why had Roosevelt kept this information from his own vice president? Burns couldn't provide technical details, but he impressed upon Truman the absolute secrecy surrounding the project. Fewer than a dozen people in Washington knew the full scope of what was being developed. The cost was enormous, running into billions of dollars. Scientists and engineers were working around the clock at facilities across the country. Everything was compartmentalized, with each group knowing only their specific piece of the larger puzzle. The mention of world-destroying weapons added another layer of complexity to decisions about ending the Pacific War. If such weapons existed, they would fundamentally change military calculations, but Truman still didn't know when they might be available, whether they would actually work, or how they might be used. The partial information was almost worse than complete ignorance because it raised questions he couldn't answer. Meanwhile, the daily reality of presidential responsibility continued grinding forward. Casualty reports arrived from Pacific battlefields. Families wrote letters asking about missing sons. Congressional leaders demanded explanations for budget requests they didn't understand. Allied commanders needed immediate decisions about troop deployments and strategic priorities. Truman established a brutal daily routine, starting before dawn with intelligence briefings and continuing until late evening with meetings, phone calls, and document reviews. He was trying to compress years of wartime leadership experience into days and weeks. Every decision felt potentially catastrophic because he lacked the context to fully understand implications and consequences. The president found himself relying heavily on advisors he barely knew, men who had worked closely with Roosevelt but viewed Truman as an inexperienced outsider. Some were helpful and patient, willing to explain background and context. Others seemed resentful of having to educate someone they considered unprepared for the office. The dynamics were awkward and sometimes tense, adding personal stress to an already overwhelming situation. Foreign leaders were also adjusting to the change in American leadership. Churchill sent carefully worded messages testing Truman's understanding of various agreements and commitments. Stalin's communications became more formal and less cooperative. Allied commanders in the field were uncertain about whether existing plans and policies would continue under the new administration. These international relationships required immediate attention because military operations couldn't wait for Truman to complete his education. Decisions about troop movements, supply allocations, and strategic priorities needed to be made daily. Every choice committed American forces and resources in ways that would affect the war's outcome and the post-war world. The pressure was building toward what Truman sensed would be the most important briefing of his presidency. Stimson had scheduled a comprehensive meeting for April 25th, promising to provide complete details about the secret project he had mentioned so briefly on that first overwhelming day. Truman knew that whatever he learned in that meeting would fundamentally change his understanding of the choices he faced. 2 weeks into his presidency, Harry Truman was beginning to grasp the magnitude of decisions approaching. The mysterious weapon, the invasion planning, the diplomatic complexities, the daily casualty reports, all of it was converging toward choices that would determine not just the end of World War II, but the shape of the post-war world. And he was the man who would have to make those choices, ready or not. On the morning of April 25th, 1945, 13 days after becoming president, Harry Truman sat in the Oval Office reviewing casualty reports from Okinawa. The numbers were staggering. American forces were dying at rates that made previous Pacific battles look like skirmishes. Japanese resistance was more fanatical than anyone had anticipated. Kamikaze attacks were sinking American ships faster than they could be replaced. The island that was supposed to fall quickly had become a grinding meat grinder, consuming lives at an unsustainable pace. At precisely 10 o'clock, Secretary of War Henry Stimson arrived for the meeting that would change everything. With him was Brigadier General Leslie Groves, a man Truman had never met but whose name appeared on budget documents requesting enormous sums for unspecified purposes. Groves had entered through the White House back door to avoid reporters. A precaution that struck Truman as oddly theatrical until he understood what was at stake. Stimson carried a thick folder marked with classifications Truman had never seen before. The security protocols surrounding this meeting were unlike anything in his limited presidential experience. Staff members were dismissed. Guards were posted at unusual positions. Even the president's secretary was excluded from taking notes. The atmosphere was heavy with the kind of secrecy that suggested either breakthrough or catastrophe. General Groves began with a statement that sounded like science fiction. The United States had been developing atomic weapons capable of destroying entire cities with single bombs. The project, codenamed Manhattan, had been running for 3 years at a cost of $2 billion. Facilities across the country employed over 100,000 workers, most of whom had no idea what they were building. The scientific principles involved the splitting of uranium atoms, releasing energy equivalent to thousands of tons of conventional explosives. Truman listened in stunned silence as Groves explained the technical details. The first weapon would be ready by early August. It would have the destructive power of 20,000 tons of TNT. One airplane carrying one bomb could eliminate an entire city. The blast would create temperatures rivaling the surface of the sun. Buildings would vaporize, people would be killed instantly across areas measured in square miles. The implications were staggering. American military planners had been calculating invasion casualties based on conventional warfare assumptions. If atomic weapons could force Japanese surrender without invasion, hundreds of thousands of American lives might be saved. But the weapons represented something unprecedented in human history. They weren't just bigger bombs. They were qualitatively different, capable of destruction on scales that defied imagination. Stimson emphasized the broader consequences of possessing such weapons. The United States would emerge from the war with capabilities no other nation possessed. The balance of global power would shift fundamentally. Future conflicts would operate under completely different assumptions. The atomic bomb wasn't just a military tool. It was a strategic reality that would reshape international relations for generations. But there were complications. Intelligence suggested that the Soviet Union was beginning its own atomic research. Russian scientists understood the theoretical principles. With sufficient resources and time, they could develop similar weapons. The American monopoly would be temporary, lasting perhaps 4 years at most. How that monopoly was used during its brief existence would determine whether atomic weapons became tools of peace or instruments of unprecedented destruction. Groves presented targeting options that military planners had already developed. Japan's major cities were ranked by strategic value and symbolic impact. Tokyo, Yokohama, Kyoto, Hiroshima, Kokura, and Nagasaki topped the list. Each target offered different advantages in terms of military installations, industrial capacity, and psychological effect on Japanese leadership. The selection would depend on weather conditions, aircraft availability, and strategic priorities that hadn't been finalized. April 25th, 1945 marked the end of Harry Truman's innocence and the beginning of the atomic age. In just 13 days, a man who'd been deliberately excluded from every major wartime decision found himself holding the power to reshape human civilization. The mysterious explosive that Stimson had mentioned so vaguely on that first overwhelming night was now revealed as humanity's most terrible creation. Truman's education in presidential responsibility had culminated in the ultimate test of leadership. The haberdasher from Missouri, who had felt like the moon and stars had fallen on him, now held the power to make the sun fall on others. The decisions ahead would determine not just the end of World War II, but the very nature of warfare itself. In 48 hours, Harry Truman had transformed from a forgotten vice president into the man who would decide humanity's atomic future.